This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Should I start it over?
Sure.
Okay, here we go.
What year did you start working in Barrow, which is now known as Utrecht, and what brought you there?
Great. Well, let me first start by, if I may, Roberta, by saying thank you to you and Jana and to Ben Jones for allowing me to make this recording. It's a real pleasure for me, and I'm just so sorry I can't be up there with you. And I also want to congratulate UIC Science for this 75th celebration. It's really wonderful. I managed to make the 50th, and I won't make the 100th. So anyway, in answer to your question, my first visit to Barrow was in 1971. And I was able to continue the kind of research I've been doing in Canada. And it worked out very successfully for me and made a big difference to my research career. But if I may, I'd like to tell folks of a little anecdote. They may enjoy it. So in 1969, I emigrated from Canada to Boulder, Colorado. A month or two after that, I learned about a conference being held in Edmonton called the Productivity of Northern Circumpolar Lands, which is right up my alley. So I thought, well, this is great. So I asked my director if I could go back to Canada for this meeting. And he said, oh, okay. And I did. And the meeting was wonderful. And one evening in the meeting, I was a bit tired, so I decided to go to bed. And I just settled down in bed, and there was a knock on the door. So in my pajamas, I went and opened the door. And who was there but Jerry Brown? And Jerry said, I just run into your thesis advisor down in the lobby of the hotel, and he tells me you're an expert on ordination and vegetation. He said, what is that? And then, may I come in? So he came in and he sat on my hotel bed and we talked for quite a while. After that, he said, well, Pat, do you think the University of Colorado would be prepared to host sort of a planning meeting for the International Biological Program, the US Tundra Bio Program? So I agreed to host this planning meeting for the US Tundra Bio Program, which turned out that it would be held in Barrow. The meeting, it was going to be a 4-year program to be held in Barrow. So I had the task of housing or finding places for the attendees to live. And I noticed on the list there were 3 names which I recognized. Well, I've not met them: Max Brewer, Max Britton, and Frank Pachelka. And I knew how famous they were. So I put those 3 guys in the same cabin and made sure they had a bottle of Johnny Walker and some ice. Well, they became lifelong friends, that was true. They've all passed on, which is sad to say, but anyway, that's the anecdote, and that led then to me coming to Barrow for the first time in 1971.
Oh, what highlights stand out from your experience doing Arctic research?
Going to Barrow was in fact was the starting of my real career in Arctic science. It was remarkable. Previously I worked in Greenland, in central Baffin Island, and in southern Hudson Bay, and always at places which were really isolated, no settlements nearby, and I was living out of a pup tent with freeze-dried food with one undergraduate assistant. That was how I operated. And going to Barrow, to Naval Arctic Research Lab, was so different because we had good housing, we had good food, and we had the joy. I had the joy of so many scientists there that they could that I could work with and interact with. I mean, that was the highlight of my Arctic career, and the start, really the start of my real Arctic career. If it hadn't been for meeting people like Steve McLean, Waldo Shell, Dwight Billings, Gus Shaver, that's the botany crew. My career would have, I think, just simply stumbled and not been particularly exciting. But getting to know those folks and working with them and exchanging ideas and sharing my data, that was really what took off and I think made my Arctic career so successful. Then subsequently, I had a raft of students, undergraduates and graduate students, who worked with me at Barrow. And many of them have gone on to be first-rate, in fact, some of the best Arctic scientists around. To name a few names would be Skip Walker, Donald Walker, who was at the UAF, Bob Hollister, who is now a professor at Grand Valley College Grand Valley State College in Michigan, and a postdoc I had who must not be forgotten is Craig Tweedy and his wife Vanessa Lochie. I mean, that is what really, I think those are the highlights of my Arctic career.
Let's see, are there things that you learned from Arctic residents or indigenous knowledge holders that helped you as a scientist understand what you were seeing, and what were they?
Yes, I think so. I think the names that come to mind are people who facilitated my research, and I did learn from them. There are three people they come to my mind. One is, well, of course, I mentioned Max Brewer. He was so generous with me as a young man. And then people like Kenny Tuvak, the great Kenny Tuvak. He just knew how things worked up there. He knew how nature worked. And just to talk to him about the complications of permafrost working with vegetation and the problems of building on permafrost, things like that I had never thought about. It was great to learn that with him. Well, another person who really helped a great deal was, I think, Roberta, is that your dad? Richard dad?
Yeah, that's my dad.
Oh, Richard was fantastic. He was so gracious. If I had problems, I would go to Richard and he would listen and he would have a solution for me in terms of how to work things out. And later on, he was so important to, with setting up BASC, the Barrow Arctic Science Committee, and the Barrow Environmental Observatory. Those were key things which would not really have come to pass if Richard hadn't helped. He just knew how to explain things to people, explain things to me, and explain people to the elders and the other people in the town. It was great. And finally, I might say another person who helped me a great deal was Edna McLean. Edna was later, and I knew Edna when she was looking after her two sons at Barrow. And then later, when she was president of Elisabeth College, it was just great to talk to her about teaching issues and, administration issues of things like that. Because by that time, I was director of this, that, and the other, and we had similar problems. And so it was great to share those problems with each other. So those are the highlights of my Arctic career, at Barrow.
So our last question is, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, if you forgive me, or if the listeners will, or viewers will forgive me, I'm just an old fart, but I do have some principles that I have found helpful, and maybe I could just pass those thoughts on to people. Firstly, even if your science is very focused on some small thing, exciting thing, but small thing, be sure to share your work with others and remember the neighboring interdisciplinary issues and don't ignore them, okay? So the second idea would be, I am a great believer in, when designing science, to use the hypothesis method. You have a question, but develop a hypothesis to be tested. And then when you've done all, but also, most importantly, measure things beyond your hypothesis. Don't just focus exactly on that hypothesis, but make measurements and look at things beyond the hypothesis, okay? And finally, what you've got to do is to share that data with other people and archive your data. Make sure it's available to others in this life or in life beyond this one. But I must say, greetings to everybody. I do wish UIC Science and NARL the very, very best in the future. I think you have a very, very bright future. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see.
Good job.
And now, still sharing my screen. Oh, I don't know. I'll now we'll hear from David Norton. Let's
Hi, Dave.
see. Wait.
He's online with us.
Oh, hello, my apologies. I was trying to get on starting at 9 o'clock and something didn't work. And I had to go and re-sign up for my account, and it just took forever. So sorry about that.
David, did you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, I'm Dave Norton. I'm currently at UAF as a retired research adjunct, and I wholeheartedly wish I could have made it to Barrow this week, but just wasn't going to happen. I spent lots of time at UIC NARL and really treasure that experience deeply. So I started here as a graduate student. I enjoyed 5 years of working as a grad student, and I came back as a research manager during OCS years and spent time at Elisavik College in the 1990s. We lived in Utqiagvik and were, I hope, improved measurably by the experience.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, I'll go ahead and I'll start your video. What year did you start working in Barrow, now known as Utqiagvik, and what brought you there?
I started in 1968. The date was the 18th of May. I remember it very clearly. What brought me to Utqiagvik, then Barrow, was fascination with the North. I had spent 3 years in the tropics right on the equator, and it was totally mind-blowing. I was ready for a change. And so I got as far north as I could for my graduate studies and was instantly wowed by the beauty, the simplicity, the straightforwardness of the Arctic and the people, and the Naval Arctic Research Lab was overwhelmingly good.
What highlights stand out from your experience doing Arctic research?
Many, many, many highlights. The science was wonderful. I enjoyed it tremendously, even though as I will talk about it later next week, it was an accident that I went there to study something that never happened. But I was lucky in getting on to wonderfully interesting problems. But even better than the science were the people. I enjoyed the social atmosphere, the cooperation, the unprecedented goodwill of so many people. I think that's what I look back on most fondly, is the people of the place and the importance of the institution, what it contributed. So I was thoroughly and for years fascinated with the place.
Let's see, are there things you learned from Arctic residents and Indigenous knowledge holders that helped you as a scientist understand what you were seeing, and what were they?
Oh, there were so many things, so many people. It's hard to know where to begin or where to end. Not only did I begin in 1968, which is an eternity ago to many people, but I came back again and again and again after I was done with my graduate studies, and I was perpetually helped by people, some long-term wonderful people like Kenneth Tuvok Sr. I think he taught me how to drive a weasel about the second day I was there. I don't know if there are any weasels still on display anywhere, but they're tricky to drive, and he was a wonderful teacher. And he stayed sort of my mentor and primary teacher for years and years. He helped, for example, in the year 2001, helped me and other scientists figure out how the heck we had overlooked an event in 1957 that wiped out the equipment of all the Barrow whalers, including Harry Brower Sr., who contributed to a book by Karen Brewster, all of his experiences, and he was put out of business for 15 years after the event in 1957. It's called the EVU, or the Ice Override event, and Kenneth Tuvok helped us figure out what the catastrophe was all about, why it happened, how it happened. He and meteorologists from the U.S. Weather Service worked together, and that's just one instance of many people who in Utqiagvik were very helpful to many scientists, not just to me. So it was a continuingly marvelous experience.
And so we just have one final question. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm looking forward very much to the rest of the proceedings of the 75th anniversary of NARL. Wish I could be there, but other circumstances are holding me up in Fairbanks. So I look forward to learning more from you and other participants. So I'm looking forward to what now looks like next week.
And now we'll hear from Carl Benson. I see that Carl is online. Carl, did you want to start with a few words briefly?
Well, I think the proceedings, to be able to watch them at home on Zoom when I can't get there, is really, it's quite an amazing feat. And I'm enjoying this very much, and I look forward to seeing the rest. I'm a little apprehensive about how mine comes out, but I'll see. So thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
So what year did you start working in Barrow, which is now known as Utqagvik, and what brought you there?
Well, my first time in Barrow was in 1950 with the U.S. Geologic Survey, and I was part of the Naval Oil Unit, where the Navy wanted to investigate what oil, if any, is in Petroleum Reserve Number 4. So they contracted with the Geologic Survey or requested them just to form a group to study this. And that was in the USGS. It was referred to as the Navy Oil Unit. And the chief of it was George Gritch. I'm sure you've heard of that name. George was a graduate at the University of Minnesota, where I was at the time. And he inspired the young people, and I was very young then, much younger than I am now. But we saw the building of geologic maps, which was just done only on streams, because that's what they did, is to go down the streams in fold boats from up in the, where they had been landed up into the Brooks Range or just below it. And they mapped in those paths, and then when I joined them, I was keen to get up there. That was in 49, 50. And we had air photos made in 1949 that we mapped directly on in 1950. So the survey then had what they called the line haul, went from Fairbanks to Barrow to Umiat and Barter Island, and then back to Fairbanks. Some days it would not go to Barter Island, but it almost went from Fairbanks to Barrow and then to Umiat. So that's my first time in Barrow was there, and I had a meal at the lab and got a chance to look around a little bit, but not much because we went right on into Umiat. I came back to Barrow after I finished with that, and I finished my graduate work at Caltech and came back to Alaska in 1960 and started working on the seasonal snow cover. And that was all done out of the lab at Barrow. But I wanted to find places where I could measure the drifted snow. The goal here was to find out how much snow came down and how much was moved by the winds in each direction. And in 1980, published a paper on that called A Reassessment of the Winter Precipitation on the Arctic Slope. And it was based on earlier work done by Bob Black of the USGS, where he identified that the weather records were always less than reality. And so there was much more precip there than showed in the records. And I measured the snow on the tundra directly in places where there were no drifts. And then the drift to get at the amount of blowing snow in each direction, two primary directions. I worked with people from the Forest Service. They've been building snow fences to keep the snow off certain roads, and especially in Wyoming. And they came up with a system of putting a snow gauge with fences around it to stir the wind and help the snow deposit. That gave a much higher record of what actually comes down. And so we built the first of those on the Arctic slope. And then came up with the idea of building fences. And at first people said, no, we don't have any fences here. They didn't understand, I think, what we were talking about, because what we were trying to do is build a fence just to make a drift form behind it, and that would keep the snow from forming further down. The first one was at Wainwright, where houses were being totally buried by drifts.
And we managed to get all the drifted snow behind this one big snow fence, and the houses were pretty well clear of snow at the time. It also built a big reservoir of water that could be used for drinking water if people kept the place clean, but with dogs running all over the place, it was hard to do.
What highlights, if any, stand out from your experience doing research in the Arctic?
Well, the highlight is understanding how the snow cover looks. The snow across the whole Arctic slope is very much like the snow in the Greenland ice sheet for the first year. And in Greenland, you just add another year on top of another year and another year. The ice sheet keeps growing, and the reason it doesn't increase in altitude is because of the flow. On the Arctic slope, you get that same structure for the first year, where there's this very little depth north. I think the Inuit name for that is pukak, at the base of the snow cover, a very coarse crystalline material. That forms because of the steep temperature gradient in the snow, and it changes the structure. The top part is usually hard and wind-packed. That's exactly the sort of thing that you get in the first year on the ice sheet. But it impressed me that the whole Arctic slope and the northern part of Siberia and Canada all has that same structure to the first year of snowpack. The other thing was just being in the Arctic. I've always enjoyed that from my first year in 1950. That convinced me of my earlier interest that this is just a great place to work. I enjoyed working at the lab. I remember the Quonset huts that we stayed in. There was that one big two double-deck Quonset hut that we had. I know I had a place to stay there a couple times. And it was especially interesting in the winter when there was snow blowing hard outside and you were snuggled into your sleeping bag inside the hut. And the mess hall was always good. We had wonderful food. So I thought of the barrel as a base for a laboratory. It's just perfect. And I think if you can keep this going, and I hope it is going just like it was when it was, we called it ARL at the time. And then the Navy worried that people were forgetting that they funded it, so they wanted an N put on the front for Naval Arctic Research Lab.
So are there things that you learned from Arctic residents or Indigenous knowledge holders that helped you as a scientist understand what you were seeing, and what were they?
I learned from, I think Pete Savalik, I think you remember him, and Kenny Tuvek. They both knew a lot about the Arctic and the winds and problems of dressing and keeping yourself from freezing to death. Kenny Tuvek was especially valuable out on the ice with people. And I learned from, it was Harry Brower and one of his friends, and the two of them went out with us to Lake Nolek to build a little cabin one time for to be used as a research base. And I just learned things in general, not necessarily towards the research, but they understood the way the snowpack looked and how it formed. And I was impressed though that they had a lot of knowledge that people like the birds, even birds that weren't useful for game birds, for eating or anything like that, they seemed to know a lot about just the natural cycle. And it always appealed to me that this would be a great place, especially for the biologists and bird people, to be getting to know the people. But I learned a little bit about that, but that's because that wasn't my field. I was just impressed how much knowledge there was.
Do you have any closing thoughts? Do you have anything else you want to add or mention?
One closing thought I would have is I think the lab did a lot for science. I think it did a lot for the people of Barrow. Because rather than hiring all people from outside, and I think Max Brewer deserves a lot of credit there, they made sure they had a lot of people from the village working at the lab. And this then, first of all, economically, it put money into the village in the hands of people that weren't, there were several rich, wealthy families in Barrow early on, mainly from running the store that Browers had. Now you had people in the village that had money separate from the old style, so it changed the economy to some extent. But I think the lab has proven to be valuable for research, but I think it was valuable also for the community at Barrow, to, first from the point of view of income, but also from the point of view of education. They learned a lot about what was being done in the world outside of Barrow, and what research was important. And then they fit into many of these projects. I was impressed with how ingenious some of the people were there at maintaining equipment and doing things. Even out in the field, they would take apart a snow machine. And one time I was working at Atkusak, and we were studying that big set of drifts there. And all of a sudden, some people just showed up. Two young men showed up, and they said, "If you have radio contact with Barrow, we need some parts." I thought, well, they might need spark plugs or something. So we need a piston rod. And oh my God, they were taking the whole thing apart and rebuilding it out there. And so we put it in order, and things came. And that impressed me because a lot of people that came, let's say, came out of different parts of the States or any part of the lower latitude having trouble, they just say it's broken and leave it and go away. These guys found out what was wrong, they're going to fix it right there. And they did. And that impressed me a lot. Harry Brower, when we were there, he carved, there was a piece of walrus, I mean, not walrus, but a mammoth tusk on it, and it was coming apart in little flakes. It had the curve of the tusk. But he carved a neat little knife-looking letter opener. It looked like a little knife, had a hilt on, a little handle, and then the blade for letter opener. And as we were leaving, I saw him carving on this thing. When we were leaving, he said, "Here, I want to give this to you as a memento of our time here." And that means a lot to me. I still have it, a little case with some ivory carvings, but that I just really got to love the people.
Up next, we will hear from Jerry Brown. Jerry, did you want to start with a few words?
Well, possibly. I think you're aware I sent up last night a short PowerPoint, which I'll probably want to have at the end of this. But I'd just like to say it's great seeing Pat and Carl and Dave and hearing, reminiscing about all the old days and trying to remember when I really did meet Pat in his bedroom up in Canada. I certainly don't remember that, but Pat certainly not. And it's what out with us today, but we're in contact with him and he's doing real well. And Carl, I think Carl just went away. It was great seeing Ruth there in both in life and video. we've not connected in a long time. So no, I think go ahead, Roberta. Appreciate what you're doing. My PowerPoint afterwards is kind of predates what we're talking about in the video. So hopefully there's not going to be any duplication. But go ahead and run the video and then pick up at the other end.
Okay.
So it was 1957 as an undergraduate. I had the privilege of being working as a soils technician on a project from Rutgers University. Rutgers had a long heritage in the 50s of graduate students doing their dissertations on the North Slope. And I became, I think, number 4 in terms of the dissertation, but I was preceded by 3 others at least, under the tutelage of John Tedrow, who was a famous polar soils. I was working on a project in those days looking at the evolution of carbon dioxide from Arctic soils. That was back in 1957. And I was a soil technician doing the measurements all summer. We were in the old ARL building, which the skeleton of which I think still existed at Gnarl, but I'm not sure. It burned down, there was a fire, and most of it was destroyed. I don't know if they destroyed the building or not. It's just in front of the, what was called the Animal Research Building. I forgot the acronym for that. In any event, it's 1957 was a great summer for me and a great experience. And I then later, as soon as I became a graduate student, I returned to Barrow to do my dissertation in the Brooks Range. So I spent 3 summers in the Brooks Range, in the eastern Brooks Range in Anwar. What was not then Anwar, but looking at soils formation, and it was a great experience and a great introduction to the logistical capabilities of ARL and NARL at the time.
What highlights stand out from your experience doing Arctic research?
Well, you know, my entire career was, as I mentioned, was devoted to Arctic research, so it's really difficult to pinpoint any one thing. It was the support we got for logistic support for drilling, watering, and of course all the native folks that were involved, including your grandfather, I believe, were instrumental to the success of our work. Well, in any event, a lot happened there in the 60s due to the support we got from the local ARL. And that was followed in the 70s by a very large international program, which kept Barrow on the map in terms of scientific leadership internationally. That was a Tundra International Biological Program, Tundra Research Program. And so there's been many fond memories back then. And that later led to the work in NPRA during the cleanup of the at 4 and then along the Hall Road when the road became, the highway became available. But everything came out of Barrow at one point or another for much of my career. So I owe a lot to the local community as well as to the people that were all involved. Kenny Tuvak comes to mind, and many, many others who helped us do the work that we were required to do.
Are there things you learned from Arctic residents or Indigenous knowledge holders that helped you as a scientist understand what you were seeing, and what were they?
You know, that's a real tough one. I think other disciplines can answer that question much more easily than I can. But the things that I looked at, permafrost and soils, were not traditionally the topics of the local folks. Let me leave it at that. Other than knowing that if you did the wrong thing, the permafrost would start thawing and things of that sort. But so it's hard to say. I depended a great deal on local residents. Let me put it that way. And then by depending upon them, I guess I learned a lot. But it's almost impossible for me to pinpoint, what I learned. We did it later on in the late 90s, early 20s. We did have a project on meat cellars, And that brought us in contact with many, many folks, including your parents with your meat cellar. We were instrumenting in meat cellars to look at the gradual warming of permafrost and the impact on storage and quality of the foods that were in the meat cellar. So we had a lot of contact with local residents, including Harry Brower with his Barrel meat cellar, community meat cellar. And I guess I did learn a lot. I didn't realize that the entrances to the meat cellars, some of them would be kept open during the winter to cool them. I would never have thought of that, but I remember Harry telling me that. And then we learned a great deal, about the management of meat cellars and this how important they were and still are, I assume. So I have a feeling at the meeting this week, you're going to hear about a traditional meat cellar at ARL, the one that was put in during the 1940s when the Navy was supporting the Pet 4. Because there's a traditional meat cellar about 40 feet deep right near the bark. And we keep talking about it because it'd be a wonderful opportunity to reoccupy it and use it as a research base. Ben Jones will be talking about this, I'm quite certain. So in any event, I that kind of a rambling answer to your question. Yeah, we just got to know a lot of the local residents who were working at Norton. And they were always good companions and friendly, colleagues. And so that's an experience that we all remember and cherish and respect. So I think that's the best way I can answer that.
Do you have any closing thoughts?
Okay, well, it's a combination. Since the 50th anniversary, and I'll be reporting on this during the conference, we developed the Barrel Environmental Observatory, and one very major aspect of that was outreach. It was all done under the Barrel Arctic Science Consortium, BASC in Glen Sheehan. We put a tremendous amount of effort into that in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century, up until about 2010 or so. So one aspect was outreach, and we spent a lot of time with the schools. So I don't know whether, as you were growing up, if you had any experience with us, but the science teachers were involved, Leslie Pierce, Tim Buckley, and many others, with bringing students out to the BEO out along Keikita Road. Some folks won't know what I'm talking about, but you do. The students are still coming out. It seems like it's carried forward from those days in the 90s and early 2000s when students were involved hands-on. So I think that to me is the lasting experience of our efforts during those days of trying to have outreach. We had a Saturday schoolyard program, which had a seminar every Saturday for several years at the Bark. I don't know, who around Barrow would remember things like that, but I don't know if it still goes on or not, but these were major outreach efforts, which I'd like to think are part of the legacy of many of the things that were going on through BASC. And I know UIC tries to sustain some of these activities, but I don't keep up on the details now. Hopefully, we do know, as you saw in you'll see when I talk, that the local schools, the elementary school kids are still coming out to the BEO. It's a field experience. So, and I hope I think you yourself are sort of an example of, the evolution of Barrow School's education system and how it translates into higher education and so on. So I think those are my lasting thoughts. I think at the 50th, I said that 25 years from then, we would still be talking about the future. And I think now, with the 75th, we'll be talking about the next 25 years. And I suspect there'll be things will continue to expand in diversity and complexity, but many of the traditional approaches will still be there. So it's been a great experience over many years. I hope these few minutes of talk will help others. So I guess I'll just conclude on that and wish everyone well in the future. next 25 years.
Thank you, Jerry. Hey, Roberta. I
Mhm.
have some slides that Jerry emailed today.
Yes.
Share my screen.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Hey, Jerry, I'm going to try to share my screen for you, okay?
Are you a host?
Yeah.
Okay. How do I? There we go.
Yeah, hi. And folks hear me? Whoops, back up a little. Don't go too fast now. I appreciate the extra few minutes here. In my presentation, I failed to mention some very important things that preceded me at Barrow. And I really like to just spend a few minutes talking about the real early days. Carl touched on some of them. He's part of that history. But there's a few other people that are, one of whom is still around, that is part of that history. And I like to just mention that if not for a top secret Air Force project in the early 50s, I would not be talking to you now, because I was a result of some of the activities that followed. And so I like to just back up to the early 50s. Carl already told us that he was at Barrow in 1950, which is certainly a monumental date in our history. But my professor at Rutgers University was John Tedrow. And back in about 20 years ago, I tried to convince him to write up a story about the Air Force top secret project, which is called the Keys Project. And he finally did do that before his passing. But I'd like to mention one of his colleagues, both of Rutgers University, was John Cantlin. John is still with us. And he's part of the legacy in my mind of the early ARL days. I use ARL, not NARL, because NARL had not existed at that point. And John, I think when we look back over the survivors of those early days, I'm not too familiar, Carl, with many other folks other than you and John Cantlin, who's at Michigan State, retired as past vice president and very senior and very well-known individual in very many areas. I'm not too sure there are many of you, Carl, that are still around. You may not have known John, actually, even though you were from Minnesota. He was just next door in Michigan. But in any event, let me go on to the next slide and talk a little about the Keys Project. The Keys Project was an secret Air Force project that was just basically looking at terrain analysis using air photos, something that still is done today, but using satellites and other technologies. It was based at Boston University. It was an Air Force project. I don't think anyone can find anything about the Keys Project other than this article in the journal Arctic, which I encouraged John Tedrow to write, and which he did reluctantly based on his own personal field notes, because there's virtually nothing available today that documents this project other than this article in Arctic. And the two individuals I'm talking about is John Cantlin in the back and John Tedrow in the foreground. Many other folks came out of this project, including Larry Bliss, who's sitting here, was one of Dwight Billings' graduate students, went on to many other tundra activities. So next slide. By the way, let me just back up and say that Keys Project was based at Umiat, but it ranged across the entire Arctic slope using weasels, the tracked vehicles that were part of the post-World War II legacy. So these folks covered the entire North Slope. It was running parallel to the USGS geological survey studies, but which are well published. However, this project has no publication other than that little note in Arctic. Next, please. So the article, without reading it, appears in the journal Arctic. It's a short article, but it certainly documents the science of the early 1950s. The folks did get to Barrow with their weasels for a short visit, but they didn't have any logistical support out of Barrow. It was being supported strictly by the Air Force, either out of one of the military bases in Alaska, directly into Umiat. Coming out of that project was John Cantlin's summary report on the vegetation of the North Slope. It's not, that again is not published, but it's an Arctic Institute report. And in that he named, called the valley of the Colville River, the Banana Belt, which I think many of you who are familiar with the North Slope know that the temperatures in the valley of the Colville Valley are fairly warmer than anywhere else on the North Slope. Partly because of its topographic situation. In any event, John used that term banana belt, which many of us have used over the years. I didn't realize it was a term used in northern Michigan to describe the climate there. I thought it came out of the Russian literature, but John straightened me out after a few decades of misuse. Next, please. So moving ahead now to 1957, after telling you what the Keys Project was, here are two of the folks that were at on the Keys, John Tedrow and John Cantlin. And this is the old sign that hung over the old ARL building. And a group of us, all of us from Rutgers were at Barrow in 1957. This is me. Two of the PhDs that had completed, that were responsible for soils work, Jim Drew, who later became the Dean of Agriculture in Fairbanks, and Lowell Douglas, the person I was working for in 1957, and Abercrombie, that was the boycott, the Barrow dog boycott. Everyone got to know Abercrombie, and the other dog was JB. Hate to go on about this, but people who are still around of that generation will know those two dogs. Next, please. So I mentioned in my talk the work that I was doing in 1957. This is right near the ARM site and the NOAA site. I should say NOAA site and then later the ARM site up on the beach ridge. And we were measuring the flux of CO2 from the soils across a moisture gradient from the very dry to the very wet. And this was all before the concerns about CO2 buildup. By the way, in those days, the CO2 concentration, the NOAA folks can check me on this, was about 280. I always remember John Kelly telling me we're wondering when we would hit 300. And I think you folks can tell when that is from the various curves. But in those days, the atmospheric CO2 was around 280, I'm pretty sure, parts per million. Next, please. I've forgotten now what the next, oh yeah. So just, you've heard a little about the old lab. And I'm not sure anyone showed the old lab. I think Craig George showed part of it in his talk the other day. But this was the old lab. The main lab was here. Administrative offices were on the top floor. These were the old Quonset huts that were put in place during the war to support the operations on the North Slope. And then this was the dormitory and the recreational room and the kind of science, get together area. And between these two buildings was kind of a walkway, which later had a greenhouse. Max Brewer built a greenhouse in the middle. Some of the plumbing was here, the latrines. There was no running water or plumbing in those days. So there was a series of latrines. And then there were some outhouses that we used for other purposes, tea sheds. I'm not sure many people know what I'm talking about. And a bark somewhere back in here. I can't quite decide where it is, but it's there. So anyway, those of you who, I believe the only building that's still there, I think it was mentioned by Richard Glenn or someone, is this building. This one is no longer there. And I spent my summer of 1957 in this lab right over here. So this is a very familiar building. Next, please. I wanted to mention in the 50s, this is what a lot of the folks looked like. We were issued the Navy clothing and everyone wore those khakis. Usually on July 4th, there'd be a picnic that would either go down to the monument or be somewhere around the lab. This would have been the photograph taken, I believe, on a July 4th picnic day. I'm not sure of the year. I don't see myself in it, so it could predate me. This is Frank Patelka, and this is Pete Zavala. This may be, I'm not sure. I had the name earlier today, one of the local folks. John O'Sullivan, Burrell Shanks, John Caranda, a whole bunch of folks that you won't, may be only names in the history. But one thing that's missing, as you probably notice, is that there are very few women. In fact, there were no women researchers at Barrow until I would say the late 60s. I believe, although I will back up and say Vera Alexander and Rita Horner from the University of Washington and then University of Alaska showed up at some point in the 60s, possibly in the early 60s. But it was a tundra biome, I believe, that broke the gender barrier. Dave and a few others can verify, and certainly Pat would if he was online. But in any event, researchers at Barrow up until the mid 60s, I would say, was predominantly men, for better or worse. And that's history is pretty well documented, I think, Dave, and a lot of what you did for the 50th anniversary volume. Next, please. And then finally, I didn't spend, my thesis was in the Brooks Range, as mentioned somewhere along the way. And so I did spend two or three summers in the Brooks Range before returning to Barrow when I was employed by Krell. And that when we started our major permafrost investigations in the 60s. But this is John Cantlin, who I mentioned earlier. He was my kind of ecological mentor. Bill Malcolm, one of his students from Michigan, were actually Rutgers at that time, and then myself. And I think someone mentioned pup tents. This was our tents when we were going out on overnight trips to cover the ground. We had no vehicles, obviously, in those days. We were put in the field in the Cessna 180s coming out of Barrow with a summer supply of pretty much the food and other things, although we'd get weekly supplies as needed. No radio contact for the entire summer. So that would have been the way research was being done in the 40s and 50s. But those were the good old days, and I think that's my last slide. And I just wanted to remember John Cantlin, and who's still there in Ann Arbor and East Lansing, and one of the early pioneers, along with John Tedrow, as part of my heritage of Barrow. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jerry. Carl, sure. So Carl Benson, can you hear me?
That was great, Jerry. Thanks.
Yeah, Carl's still online. If you guys can stay online for another few minutes.
Carl, I just wanted to show you a photo. This is from some field work I was doing this past April out at Tushy-Puck Lake. Just to show you how good these local logistical support folks are. Thomas and Ben traveled out from Barrow to what is the old gnarl cabin there at Tushy-Puck Lake Observatory, what we call it today. There's one reason or another, we always get ourselves into a pickle when we're out on our extended snow machine trips, and it's nice to be able to rely on UIC Science to come out and to help us. So not only did they completely rebuild the suspension on 3 machines, they were essentially making custom parts in the field. You know, it's like, it blew my mind. By the way, this is, so I'm Ben Jones, Carl, and this is also Ben Jones right here. Yeah, highly impressive, and I just wanted to let you know that I got the blessings from Max Brewer and also Kenny Tuback before they passed to basically resurrect this old gnarl cabin at Tushy-Puck Lake and turn it into more or less a modern day research station.